Hi, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here. And today we're going to be talking about economic growth and the evolution of growth theory. You should really get yourself something to eat, something to drink, to sit in for these lectures. This lecture is actually going to be broken into 3 parts. You may want to take a break in between, but we're really going to dig deep here because leading up to this point, we've set ourselves up with a pretty strong foundation of the theoretical concepts that we need to understand how nations grow over time, why their growth in wealth actually does matter, and theoretically how economists have altered and changed the model of growth to match real world conditions as we see them happening. So sit tight, you're in for a little bit of a ride here. So we're going to talk about how we measure wealth, why that matters, and what it has to do with economic growth. And specifically, we'll break down the sources of growth, looking at different capital resources, changes in technology, and the role of institutions. So wealth matters because wealthier societies tend to provide better living standards. And better living standards matter because this means that the people that live in that culture, in that society, have access to better nutrition, more educational opportunities, better healthcare outcomes, more political freedoms, and even things that we sometimes take for granted, such as having more sources of leisure and entertainment. You should remember that we use GDP, or gross domestic product, or gross domestic product per capita, as our main indicators of economic wealth. Gross domestic product, remember, can be broken down into the categories of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. GDP, therefore, is the measure of a nation's income overall, the end value of all products, goods, and services produced during a specific time in a specific country. And when we take that measure and divide by the population, we get GDP per capita, or in other words, per person. And this gives us an average, a basis for understanding what the typical citizen lives with in terms of living standards. Now, of course, because this is an average, there will always be people who are much wealthier and much poorer than that average. But it's an indicator for us on how well the nation is doing as a whole. So in your ebook, in your textbook, I encourage you to go and look at this page. There's a table, it's table 11.1. And it shows human welfare indicators for a selection of rich and poor countries. Now, the table is really large. So here in this slide, I've taken an average for the countries that I'm considering to be poor nations and an average of the countries that I'm considering to be the wealthy or the rich nations. So in that original table, the countries that are averaged to be the poor nation column are countries like Bangladesh, Haiti, North Korea, Niger, Liberia, Tanzania, Nepal, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. The wealthy nations that I've averaged here into this table include Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, Germany, South Korea, and the United States. So let's look at just these first couple of indicators. We're going to really break down this table. So we're really looking here at a huge difference in GDP per capita, which is a measure that we use to look at average living standards. So you can see that on average across those wealthy nations, GDP per capita is over $47,000 per year, whereas in the poorer nations, it's on average. So remember average, meaning that there are some that are lower than this, averaging just $2,000 per capita per year. Now, this first group of indicators, infant mortality rate, life and life expectancy, are really related to how long a person can expect to live in these societies. In general, in the poor countries, 53 out of 1,000 babies will die at birth or within the first year of life. While in the richer nations, this number is only about 4 out of 1,000. This means that in poor nations, infants are 13 more times likely to die during childbirth. And those that survive for 1 year are about 15 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday. So overall life expectancy in poor nations caps out around 63 years old, while in wealthy nations, we're looking at an average of 80 years. So just being born in a wealthier nation is essentially adding 20 years to your lifetime. Sorry, that's my cat in the background. Kitty. So the second group of indicators are health indicators that help to explain that mortality data. Rich nations tend to have 14 times as many doctors per person. So we're looking at 29 physicians for every 10,000 people versus just 2 in poorer nations. Also, clean water and sanitation are things that we tend to take for granted in the United States, but are really available only to a fraction of people in these poor nations. Whereas in richer nations, we tend to assume that it's generally available to all. A lot of children in these poor nations die every year because they can't get clean water. And this leads to like a lot of common ailments that we can prevent here in the United States, such as tapeworms and other intestinal bacteria that are life-threatening in these poor nations. In 2010, the World Health Organization estimated that 3.6 million people died every year in these poor nations from waterborne diseases. The final group of indicators in this table tell a story about education. So first, we want to acknowledge that literacy rates in poor countries are significantly lower than literacy rates in wealthy countries. And there's a significant difference even between men and women in those poor countries. Women have a lot less access to both secondary and post-secondary education than men in these poorer nations. So we can see that, like, for example, female to male secondary enrollment, if it was equal, it would be 100%. And so you can see that it's not even close to equal in poorer countries. So while educational opportunities are rarer for all people that live in poor nations, women tend to fare the worst. So this table of data really supports the contention that per capita GDP really does matter, not for the sake of more income per se, but because it's a correlate. It correlates with better human welfare conditions like health and education that really matter to everybody. For most of human history, the average person life was really just one of subsistence living. It was just about survival. The global variation between what was considered poor and wealthy really wasn't noticeable until the year about 1700. This was the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a period of rapid technological progress that started to outpace population growth. It was called a modernization, which was a mixed blessing because for the people who lived through it. Because there were huge industrial and scientific achievements that really created these unprecedented improvements in the conditions of life for just ordinary people. So during the Industrial Revolution, which we think of mostly as happening in the 1800s, many economies moved away from an agricultural-based economy towards a manufacturing-based economy. And this is really at the very center of this big break in income growth globally. So beginning in the Industrial Revolution, the rate of technical progress became so rapid that it outpaced the rate that the population was growing. And so each individual started to accumulate more wealth. So we can see here, if you were asked at what period in time per capita GDP really started to increase faster than it had the rest of history, we're looking at the 1800s, the period of the Industrial Revolution. So it's important to note, while there is a lot of income inequality today, and income equality and inequality is something that we are definitely going to address. But overall, most people are much better off than we were just hundreds of years ago. So even like, in other words, we could say that today's poor are better off than the poor of the 1800s. Like what it meant to be poor then and what it means to be poor now in most nations is drastically different. So, you know, we have to notice also, though, that this isn't evenly distributed across the globe. So, for example, the average income in the United States in the year 1800 was about $2,000. It's per capita GDP, while in modern day times, 2016, this is when this was measured, per capita GDP in Liberia was still under $900 a year. And so that's saying that the people of Liberia today are not as well off as the people of the United States were, you know, in 1800, 200 plus years ago. In fact, if you do the math here, in the United States, our per capita GDP in the year 2000 is more than 50 times what Liberia's per capita GDP is today. So we're seeing a really uneven distribution of wealth across the globe. So both wealthy and poor nations are better off compared to 200 years ago, but the disparities between the rich and the poor really began during the Industrial Revolution because some nations were able to industrialize very quickly while some were left behind. So like, for example, if we were to look at a timeline in 1950, Liberia was a richer nation than Taiwan. But here we are, 70 years later, and Taiwan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, while Liberia still has, about $1,000, $1,200 of per capita income. So we saw Taiwan surge ahead while Liberia, while better off than they were 200 years ago, is not anywhere near on the scale of wealth that some other people are experiencing in wealthier nations. Americans today are much wealthier than most of the other places of the world, but this prosperity did not come overnight. And we have to acknowledge too that we still deal with the experience of poverty even in the United States. So, world economic growth might seem slow overall, but that small amounts of growth over a long period of time really makes a huge difference. The difference between like 0 and 1% might seem really trivial, but when measured in tens of thousands of dollars, that economic growth is really historically unprecedented. So the mathematics of growth show small changes, but really huge differences when that growth is compounded. So like I said, the way that we measure economic growth is through the indicator of real GDP per capita. So it's really important here to make sure that we know that economic growth is meaning something very specific. We're going to be looking at the measure of how the average person's income changes over time when we include allowance for price changes. So real GDP is going to compare incomes controlling for inflation and population. So we see economic growth is the percent change in nominal GDP minus the percent change in prices, which is inflation, minus the percent change in the population, which is dividing that number by a larger number of people. So that's our percent change in real GDP. So let me explain some of the math that shows up on this slide. So if we start with nominal GDP and we compute growth in nominal GDP, then we know that because that GDP is nominal, it's not taking into account inflation. So if we take into account price growth or inflation, then we can get real GDP growth. So for example, here, if we start with GDP in 2017 and looking at GDP in 2018, then we can do the math to determine that that was a change of 5.2% or a 5.2% increase in nominal GDP. But over that same period of time, if we were to look at price index, the price growth or the rate of inflation was 2.3%. So if we subtract that from nominal GDP growth, we get real GDP growth. So in real terms, taking into account the fact that prices went up over that time, overall real GDP grew only by 2.9%. Now we also have to take into account population growth. So if during that period of time between 2017 and 2018, the population grew by 0.7%, then we also have to subtract that. So overall, when we start with nominal GDP, and then we look at that growth, we subtract inflation and subtract changes of population. That's going to give us real per capita GDP growth. So when we use the phrase economic growth, what are we referring to? Something very specific. An economist talking about economic growth is specifically talking about the percent change in real, meaning inflation adjusted, GDP per capita. So growth and income levels are definitely correlated over time. If your income doubles, it means you can afford twice as much. But in order for that to happen, you need your income to grow 100%. So how long does it take for your income to exactly double? Well, we actually have a nice little rule that's easy to remember, and that's called the rule of 70. The rule of 70 says that if the annual growth rate is X%, then the size of the variable will double every 70 divided by that growth rate years. So for example, if the growth rate is 2%, then we know that income would roughly double every 35 years because 70 divided by 2 is 35. Let's try it again. If the growth rate is 3%, income roughly doubles every 23 years because that's 70 divided by 3. So you take 70, rule of 70, and you divide by the growth rate in a given year, and that tells you an approximate period of time that it would take to double that income. So what do we learn from the rule of 70? Well, that means that small, consistent growth rates, if they're sustained for a decade or two, can really impact living standards. Over the long course of history, growth rates were, essentially zero for a very, very long time, and man's general experience was dire poverty. The growth rate was zero because although there were some technological advances, it was happening at the same time as population growth. The reason we saw such great economic growth during the Industrial Revolution was that technological advances started moving faster than the population grew. The difference over the past 2 centuries has been small, but consistent. And so the rule of 70 illustrates that living standards are going to more than double in a century, even if we have just 1% growth. So here we can see an example of compounding growth. If you start in year 1 with an income of $50,000 and you know that your income is increasing at 2%, then we can use the rule of 70 to say that in 35 years, you would be able to double your income as long as you were able to maintain a consistent, although small, 2% increase in your income per year. So if the annual growth rate of an economy is 7%, how long does it take for per capita income to double? Let's use the rule of 70. 70 divided by 7, it'll take 10 years. So we can look at the actual growth rates of various countries over a long period of time and then see how that correlates or how it impacts income levels. This table represents growth rates for several countries over the time period between 1950 and 2016. And we can see that there are some countries that have almost near zero growth. In fact, countries like Haiti, Afghanistan, and Liberia have had negative growth. Whereas some of the countries listed towards the bottom of the table have had about 1% growth. And even with rates nearing 1%, if we use the rule of 70, that means that these countries with a 1% growth rate will have doubled their income in 70 years, probably less than. And so if we're looking at just even between 1950 and 2016, right, this is 66 years. And we can see, for example, Argentina more than doubled their income in that period of time. So the rule of 70 is kind of like a good gauge for how long it would be to double your gross income, per capita in a country. This is just like a continuation of the table. So there's some countries here, like the United States falls into the category of about 2% growth. Whereas we have some other countries that are growing at rates greater than 2%. The countries that we see experiencing the fastest economic growth, and this was like, again, this is data from 2016. So some of this has slowed, but we can definitely still say that countries like Japan, China, and South Korea are growing really quickly. Perhaps the fastest growth we've seen in like recent history is in China. It's really an amazing case study. I do a study abroad trip for students in China in non-COVID years. I took students there in 2013, 2015, and 2017. And it's amazing, just even in that short period of time between 2013 and 2017, to see the incredible amount of changes in the same city for the same group of people. I mean, they are lifting people out of poverty at a really fast rate. Unfortunately, there's some unintended side effects of that. We're also seeing, agricultural communities are moving into the cities. And so we have weird demographic effects happening where like basically the entire working age population has migrated into the cities, and it leaves these like large swaths of agricultural land where there are like whole towns and cities of just children and the elderly. So that's like one really strange impact. And then also like we're seeing, obviously, as this growth is happening so quickly, alongside of it is also a growth in the amount of industrial pollution that the country is experiencing. So it's not perfect, right? Growth is not a panacea to say, well, everything is better now. There's obviously like societal and like human components to how we live together that we have to take into account. But China is an extremely interesting case study, and I really hope to get back there with students in the next couple of years. So keep an eye out for that program that I'll be offering. It's like a 2-week study abroad. So you take a course during the spring semester, and then after the semester ends in the spring, there's like a week break. And then in the very beginning of the summer, we take 2 weeks and we go to China. And the first time I ran it, I went to Beijing and Shanghai. The second time I ran it, I went to Beijing and Xi'an. So stay tuned. Hopefully that will come up while you're a student at Westfield. So just rounding this out and looking at our own country in the United States, this just gives you an idea of how much the US economy has grown in the past 50 or 60 years. And one of the ways that you can tell this is even just by the size of houses as an indicator variable. So, between 1960 and 2018, we saw a jump of about 10 years in our life expectancy. About almost a doubling of the number of physicians per 10,000 people. On average, people are going to school longer, and spending a smaller portion of their overall income on food, which is like sustenance. So now they're spending more on leisure and entertainment. While at the same time, the average work week, people are working fewer than 40 hours. We've moved a lot of people out of agriculture and manufacturing sectors into the service industries, and home ownership has grown by about 3%, while houses themselves, the homes that people are buying, have almost doubled in size, right? So traditionally in 1960, a family of four had a 1,200 square foot house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. And now a family of four has a 2,600 square foot house with 4 bedrooms and 3 baths. So we are definitely seeing an increase in living standards and consumer expectations over time. So that's where I'm going to cut this piece of the video lecture. We've talked about how we measure economic growth and why it's important when we give it a context, looking at the global scale of wealth. In the next video, we're going to look at those 3 causes of economic growth: resources in the form of capital, technology, and the role that institutions play there. So hold on tight. Go, maybe take a break, stretch, get a drink, and come back, and we'll pick up where we left off with the causes of economic growth. So I'll see you in a bit.